My name is Kiefer, and we're currently overlooking Vancouver International Airport, which offers hundreds of flights a day to multiple locations in our world. Now, this may bring up the question, how did aviation become such a large industry, now being one of the fastest means of transport in our world? Well, this all leads down to our wonderful manufacturers, one of which is Boeing, whose history I want to talk about today, along with Boeing historian Annie Flodin.
So my name is Annie Flodin. I have been with the Boeing company for about 6 years, and I'm currently working on our historical services team here in Seattle, Washington. I'm a historian, and our team has the privilege of overseeing the Boeing Archives, which is a collection of about 30 million artifacts related to Boeing and its heritage companies like McDonnell Douglas, North American Aviation, dating back to the 1910s.
So now let's start from the very beginning, where the young mind of William E. Boeing was captivated by the concepts of heavier-than-air flight. Consequently, a couple years earlier, the Wright Flyer was invented by the Wright brothers, of course.
Boeing was formed in 1916 here in Seattle, but actually the big bang moment for the company came a few years earlier. So in 1910, our founder, Bill Boeing, attended an air show in Los Angeles, and he tried at that air show tirelessly to get a flight with one of the pilots that was there. He was very into technology, into aviation, and unfortunately, he was not successful in getting a flight on an airplane while he was there. He didn't have that opportunity until a few years later, up here in Seattle in 1914. He and a good friend of his, a Navy engineer named George Conrad Westervelt, took turns flying with a pilot here in Seattle. And after their flights, they put their heads together and said, we can probably build a better airplane.
And so it was. Boeing and Westervelt were on their way to create the so-called better plane. And wouldn't you know it, out comes both the B&W Model 1 and consequently the entire Boeing company. Now they had their company afloat, or more, in the air. They had to keep it going this way. This seemed easy after World War I brought them a lot of revenue from their Navy trainer Model C, but that revenue wouldn't last long. Because of Boeing being an aviation company and having a lot of these infrastructures for making wooden wings and wooden scaffolding, that everything needed to build furniture.
And when World War I ended in 1918, all of Boeing's military contracts sort of dried up. They didn't really have much left to do in the world of aviation, but Bill Boeing saw so much promise in his company and the future of aviation that he wanted to keep his people busy. And so he put them to work building, like you said, furniture and speedboats. So with the furniture, they were building things like headboards, dressers, things for bedrooms, as well as countertops for local stores. And in terms of the boats, they were building these flat bottom boats called sea sleds. And that really got them through that downturn following World War I until the aviation industry was sort of back up and running.
This was enough to keep the government out of the door and the company in the air until more revenue could be made, which was consequently one of the biggest turning points in aviation history.
Yeah, so the jet age was a really really interesting, innovative time in aviation history. Essentially, the world's first commercial jet was the de Havilland Comet, and unfortunately, it was involved in some serious accidents, and that sort of made the flying public wary of flying in jets. They didn't really want to fly in jets. They were scared. And Boeing, however, under the leadership of their CEO at the time, Bill Allen, they saw promise in jets. They knew that was the future. Bill Allen knew that was the future. So he essentially bet the company on building a prototype jet transport. It was called the Model 367-80, but we just refer to it as the Dash 80. And it was the prototype for two really important airplanes in our history, the military KC-135 Stratotanker and the Boeing 707, which was the world's first commercial jet. And Boeing and Pan Am, a longtime customer and partner of Boeing's, inaugurated the jet age with that airplane, and that sort of set the foundation for our very famous 7 Series commercial airplanes.
And thus, Boeing was on their way to gaining global fame. With business booming and a very ambitious business partner, Pan Am, they were going to start trying to pursue a daunting task.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad to talk about the 7-4 because I personally love that airplane. I know a lot of others feel the same. So it started in the mid 1960s. Again, Pan Am was a longtime customer and partner of Boeing's, and they came to Boeing wanting an airplane 2.5 times the size of the 707. And that's a really, really big difference. There's pictures out there that you can see of the 707 next to the 747. It's just incredibly stark difference there. And so Boeing turned to a man named Joe Sutter. He was tasked with leading the team to design this new gigantic airplane. And Joe Sutter did something really, really smart right off the bat, which helped the airplane have the longevity and the production run that it did. He designed it not just for passenger air travel, but for cargo as a freighter as well.
The versatility the 747 had gave it an edge over all the other airplanes in the industry. Its famous hump both allowed for better cargo flight and cargo loading, and gave it an iconic look that the public absolutely adored. This, mixed with Joe Sutter's choice to make it 2 airplanes wide instead of 2 airplanes tall, made it an instant hit for companies as well, immortalizing the 747 in history and allowing it to bring a new type of aircraft to the industry, the wide body.
The 7-4 obviously went on to change the world of aviation, really to change the world. It democratized air travel. It meant more people could afford to travel, and it truly changed the world.
With all this history, let's take a little peek into a specialized part of aviation, Boeing's contribution to the military.
So I mentioned a little bit about the KC-135 was sort of the military derivative of that jet transport prototype. Earlier yet, Boeing had built another airplane very, very important in our company's history called the B-47 Stratojet. And that was essentially the world's first large swept wing bomber. And why it's so important in terms of commercial aviation, especially, is because it really laid the framework and the design for all of our large commercial airplanes today. So that swept wing with jet engines hanging suspended from the wings in nacelles, that's really the standard design of all large commercial airplanes and military airplanes today. So Boeing had built the B-47 in the 1950s. We see the B-52, which is another very interesting story. Essentially, a group of engineers from Boeing went out to present their proposal for this new heavy bomber for the Air Force. And they had a turboprop design at first. And the Air Force said, actually, we want an all-jet design. And that was on a Thursday, and they gave the Boeing team till Monday. So they essentially redesigned the B-52 in just a few days. So as we get into the 60s, the B-52 was, of course, being built, the KC-135s, as well as other derivatives in that C-135 family. And Boeing had also at that time gotten into missiles, a lot of space travel. So Boeing and its heritage companies, McDonnell Douglas and North American Aviation, essentially built every single part of the Saturn V rocket and the Apollo space capsule, with the exception of the lunar lander. So it was a really, really exciting time at the company with a lot of innovation.
This goes to show how much even the military side of aviation can affect commercial flight. This was also when they started buying more companies and collaborating a lot.
There are a couple examples of times where Boeing worked with its competitors, which are very important stories in our history. The biggest is probably during World War II. So Boeing and other companies like Lockheed and Douglas all came together to build just an astonishing number of airplanes. They were building each other's airplanes. Boeing was building Douglas planes. Douglas was building Boeing planes. In total, the US built about 300,000 airplanes during World War II, and Boeing and its heritage companies built about 1/3 of them. So it was a pretty incredible time. At peak production, Boeing rolled out 16 B-17s in a single day. So it's pretty remarkable, pretty impressive. But then, as I mentioned as well, in the space age, Boeing and companies that are now part of the Boeing family today came together to build the Apollo spacecraft as well as the Saturn V rocket. So that's another very special story in our history.
But this isn't to say that Boeing only collaborated. Boeing had its fair share of competitions, both in commercial air travel and military contracts.
I mean, competition is always happening. It's been happening since day one at Boeing. And what I think is pretty neat is the fact that some of the companies that we used to compete very heavily with, like Douglas, McDonnell, and North American Aviation, are now part of the Boeing family. So our team, Historical Services, is very lucky to be able to preserve that history in addition to Boeing's history.
Boeing didn't always have its way in terms of acquisitions. Lockheed was, and still is, a large competitor in the military aspect of aircraft and was not bought by Boeing.
Boeing originally was competing for the C-5 contract, which obviously went to Lockheed. And if you've ever seen pictures of Boeing's entry to the C-5 competition, you can see that there are certainly some similarities in the 747 and that design. They look quite similar, but to be honest, really the only technology or design aspect that was specifically carried over from the C-5 project, which obviously went to Lockheed, onto the 747 was the new high bypass turbofan engine technology. Aside from that, really it was a completely new airplane.
Like all technology, the 747 would eventually become obsolete, though Boeing kind of did it to themselves.
And the introduction of the 777 in the 90s really sort of sealed the deal. It was much more efficient, 2 engines, and just really in line with what the future of the market and what passengers and customers wanted, as opposed to the 747, which was sort of becoming an older, not as efficient airplane at that time. But even further back with the 767, that was Boeing's first twin engine wide body airplane and the first really to fly sort of regular routes across the Atlantic. And the 76 also introduced ETOPS, so extended twin engine operations. So an airplane with only 2 engines could fly over water for a long period of time, away a certain distance from a suitable airport if one of its engines went out.
This all meant that the 747 was becoming gradually obsolete. The old hub and spoke model, which was operating large planes from one hub to the other and letting customers fly small planes to their desired location, was becoming much less preferred over a more conventional or new point-to-point model. This included having small twin jets fly from point to point, which allowed more versatility in flight paths and destinations offered. This meant all these large jumbo jets were left for these airlines to operate on the model of hub and spoke. However, one thing I find very interesting are all of these ideas that Boeing had that turned out to be not future-proof enough.
I think a really good example of that would be our SST. So, you know, the Concorde, and Boeing was planning on buying. Boeing had a government funding to build America's first SST, supersonic transport. It was going to be called the 2707. And that was happening right about the same time that the 74 was being developed. The 747 at that time was seen more of just a stopgap. Really, the big project at Boeing was the SST. That's what everyone was talking about. That's what so many people were working on. But unfortunately, government funding for that project ended. And so not that long after that, there was actually a quite big recession which led to Boeing cutting its workforce significantly. And of course, the 747 endured and ended up being an incredibly successful program. But I don't know if you've ever seen those pictures of these billboards that they used to have in Seattle that said, will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights? Because Seattle was Boeing and Boeing was Seattle. And so when this recession hit, following the cancellation of the SST, things were looking pretty bleak and the future was a little bit uncertain for the company.
Now, the Boeing company knew how to handle recession. Similar to the 1920s where they built these headboards and furniture for houses, they decided to diversify and build wind turbines, people movers, and light rail vehicles that are still used in some places today. However, there's one question I think a lot of you still have. Why did Boeing choose this peculiar 7 naming scheme?
It's kind of interesting because I feel like it's not as exciting as people wish it would be. So the 700 series was just what came next in the world of models. Boeing's always used model numbers for their aircraft. So back in the 1930s, for example, there was the Model 314, the Model 307 Stratoliner, and Boeing used model numbers for other products as well. For instance, the 500 series was used for turbine engines. The 600 series was for missiles and rockets. And so the 700 series just made sense for what came next in terms of a jet transport. However, the marketing department didn't really like the sound of 700. It didn't sound interesting and catchy enough. So they said, why don't we make it sort of catchier by calling it the 707. And so that stuck and of course lasted throughout all of the 7 series airplanes.
Now this leaves one more question. What plane comes after the 797? Well, one lesson we can learn from this whole journey we've had is that no one really knows. Like the general public back in the 60s not knowing that supersonic flight was gonna fail in the 2000s, or thinking that the 747 was the most optimal plane for all circumstances. No one really knows what plane will come after the 797, or if composites or electrical planes will last. And no one should know. The future of the aviation industry, like many times in the past, is unknown.